gives me great pleasure today to welcome all of you to our lecture series on the power of place. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College. And we have with us today a very special speaker, one of our own, Dr. Martha Hixon, whose birthday it is today. So please, round of applause. Happy birthday. That's true dedication to the University Honors College. She is one of our honors faculty members, and she was the first to teach our honors research seminar last year. And she does many, many things for the University Honors College. So we're very pleased to have her here today. Dr. Hixon teaches graduate, undergraduate, and honors courses in children's literature, children's film, and folk and fairy tales, and has mentored several honors and graduate level theses and dissertations in these areas. Her research interests are in contemporary revisions of folk and fairy tales and fantasy literature for children and young adults. Her publications include articles in the Journal of the Fantastic in the Arts and Marvels and Tales, a Journal of Fairy Tale Studies, and Telling Children's Stories, Narrative Theory, and Children's Literature, plus co-editing the first critical collection of essays on British fantasy author Diana Wynne Jones. Diana Wynne Jones, An Exciting and Exacting Wisdom, and many conference presentations. Dr. Hixon's current projects include an analysis of power structures in the fantasy texts of Jones, J.K. Rowling, and other authors, and a study of family dynamics in traditional and contemporary retellings of fairy tales. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hixon to the University Honors College.
Hi, you all. The topic of this fall lecture series is the power of place, variously defined. Since place or setting is a vital element in all literature, not just children's literature, it's as three-dimensional creatures, we conceptualize our world, fictional or real, in terms of a physical location for our actions with and within that world. So when Dr. Phillips asked me to talk about this topic in terms of my own major area, children's literature, my head started spinning with possibilities. I could have talked on, and that's the definition for setting, I could have talked on houses as setting, houses themselves, bits of houses such as bedrooms or kitchens, or by extension schools or play yards, neighborhoods, and so on. Gaston Bachelard's Poetics of Space is a seminal scholarly examination of how humans conceptualize home and react to and with the idea of home. Home is the center or heart of the stories, The Wind in the Willows and Charlotte's Web, for example. And key events in many children's books take place in specific parts of a child's home or in other locations mentioned above. It's worth considering how those places shape and affect the action of the story, but I'm not doing that. I could also have thought about cityscapes. Many children's books are set in specific real urban areas. New York City seems to be a particularly favored city. Harriet the Spy wanders the streets of 1960s New York, spying on interesting neighbors, for example. Peter Cease's Madeline visits the world by visiting the neighbors who live on her block in New York City. Ezra Jack Keats portrays the daily life of a group of multi-ethnic, lower-class urban children in the city with his stories of Peter and his friends. And there are many other examples set in New York City, but other places too. But I'm not doing that. I could also have talked about fairy tale locations, homes, forests, villages, and the paths between them, domestic spaces for girls and girl fairy tale characters, and so on. But I discarded that idea too. I decided to talk about fantasy places in a few children's classic texts that I think at least most of you are familiar with in some form or fashion from your own childhood. Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak, Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, and Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne. Each of these texts, and many, many others, feature a fantasy place in which the child characters, Max, Wendy, Michael, and John, and Christopher Robin, deal with emotional issues and situations that they encounter as they are in the process of growing up, developing their own sense of identity, and figuring out how to fit into the adult world that surrounds them, controls them, and defines them. First, a given or an assumption that would be the beginning point for today. Fantasy is the use of one's imagination encourages a child to try out his or her theories about the world in which the child finds himself or herself by allowing the child to take a step away from reality to a mental and emotional safe place, that of pretend. Today, contemporary social theorists and child psychologists agree on that. And corollary to that, books and the worlds in which they are set can serve as the site of that pretend, as the reader vicariously lives what happens in a story, identifying with the characters as they act and interact with each other and with the places that they inhabit. Case in point, Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, 1963. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another, his mother called him Wild Thing, and Max said, "I'll eat you up." So he was sent to bed without eating anything. That very night in Max's room, a forest grew and grew and grew until a ceiling hung with vines and the walls became the world all around. And you know the rest, no doubt. Max, via his imagination, sailed in and out of weeks and almost over a year to where the wild things are. Once he gets there, he tames the wild things with the magic trick of staring into their yellow eyes without blinking once. And they make him king of all wild things. King Max then declares, "Let the Wild Rumpus start." And that's him sailing over in and out of weeks and almost over a year to where the wild things are. There's a wild thing. And here he's taming them with the magic trick. And of course, they're scared of him. And they made him king of all wild things. "And now," cried Max, "let the Wild Rumpus start." And there are 3 pages in the book of the Wild Rumpus. What the slides I've just shown you do not show is how Sendak visually connects Max's imagination and the events that are being narrated. Every time a page is turned in the book, the white space surrounding the pictures gets smaller and the pictures themselves get bigger. Until the Wild Rumpus, the previous page and this page, and there's one other that I didn't include. The Wild Rumpus takes over for 3 pages. There's no white space, no text. The picture bleeds out to the edges of the book entirely. Simply wild imagination. Max then decides that he wants to be where someone loves him best of all. He tells them to go to bed. He sends them to bed without their supper. And there he is sitting in his little tent, and he's deciding he wants to be where someone loved him best of all. So he reverses his journey. So the wild things try to prevent him from leaving. "Please don't go. We'll eat you up. We love you so." And Max said no. It's not easy to quit being a wild thing and to start behaving, but Max decides it's time. So from the Wild Rumpus pages on, the pictures started diminishing in size and the white space reappeared and got bigger and bigger. Until Max returns home safely. And this is the last page in the book, the last picture in the book, not the last page, where his supper is still hot. You see it on the table. And he is, the final picture shows him pushing back his wolf suit hood, and for the first time in the book, simply smiling. You notice that he's not completely out of his wolf suit. He's just pushing the hood back. For now, that's enough. And he's got, it's kind of fuzzy, so I don't know if you can see it, but he's got a smile, whereas in the earlier pictures, it was a fierce smile or a frown. This is the first time he looks relaxed and happy. The very last page in the book has no pictures. It just says, "and it was still hot about his supper." So this is the last picture here. The connection between illustration and Max's imagination makes the underlying message of this story clear. Max, a young boy of, say, 4 or 5, wants to ignore the house rules of playing nicely, not destroying things, and not talking back to Mom. He is caged or sent to his room for time out, a classic parental strategy in socializing children and teaching them to obey socially imposed rules about behavior. Thus, Max's room becomes the place where he faces an internal conflict. Do his own thing and be wild, which is represented by his wearing the wolf suit costume and is emphasized in the illustrations, or accept the control of his mother, and by extension of society, over his behavior. Max at first resists that control, using his imagination to escape the confines of his room. He says in his head, I'm sure he's saying, you can cage the body, but you can't cage the soul. So he, at least metaphorically speaking, he escapes, and he goes to a place where not only wild things live, but where he can be king of the wild things and lead their revels until he works it out of his system. Once he does so, he can then accept the fact that he is not a wild thing, but rather a small boy who not only is hungry, but who also wants his mother. A boy willing to subdue or tame his own desires for behaving a certain way and accept his mother's rules, for now at least, along with her love and a hot supper. In Sindak's book, The Land of the Wild Things is a projection of a child's imagination, a place of self-expression, and a place where decisions about self-control can be made safely and at his own choosing. In 2009, Spike Jonze directed a live-action /animatronic/CGI film version of this book with a screenplay written by Jonze and Dave Edgars, and with the blessing of Sindak himself. And this is the cover of the film. The film maintains this central metaphor, yet amps up the tension considerably by complicating the conflict that produces Max's escape from home. I won't spend much time talking about the film here, but I do want to point out a couple of key ideas about how Jonze reconceives the use of place in the narrative. And that's the subtitle. Inside all of us is a wild thing. And they're the wild things. Whereas it is quite clear that in Sindak's book, the forest that grows in Max's room, the boat trip to the land of the wild things, and the inhabitants of that land are all products of Max's imagination. We see him standing in the room with his eyes closed. It's clear that he's imagining. Not even dreaming, he's not in bed, he's imagining. Thus, the reader, child or adult, knows that he never actually leaves home, and he is never not in control of what is happening. As king of the wild things, he excises his wild tendencies safely, and the child reader intuitively knows that that is what is happening. The situation in Jonze's film, however, is quite different. Max is 9, not 5, and his emotional or internal conflict is not just wanting to hammer huge nails in the wall, chase the dog, and sass mom. Instead, he has to deal with a broken family, an older sister who is making friends without him, and a mother who works long hours and has a new boyfriend. Jonze's Max escapes to an island where the wild things are not so easily controlled, and where at times they pose an actual physical danger to Max, though unintentionally. The wild things are enormous, and the issues they represent are equally large. Divorce, a new home, troubles at school. Max's teacher tells the class that eventually the sun is going to explode, and this really worries Max for the rest of the movie. And a general feeling of not being in control of his life or of himself. Whereas Sindak's wild things are generalized and semi-cuddly, they're rounded as much as they are spiky. Jonze's wild things are much more realized and scary. And here's a picture of some of them surrounding. It's kind of fuzzy, I think, for you guys, but Max is down there, and these are some of the wild things. They have names: Carol, Judith, KT, Alexander. They have personalities. Judith says she's the downer one. And they have their own internal issues that Max encounters as he arrives on their island. And so that's one. I just picked out a couple of, maybe 3 or 4 stills from the film, not in any particular order. Here's Max being king of the wild things. Here's King Max. He's got his crown on with Carol. And we're going to come to this one. How many of you saw that film, by the way? Oh, not that many. Okay. Another point is that whereas Sindak's story clearly has Max beginning the imagining of this place while standing in his safe, though boring, room and being quite happy at his creation and his escape from captivity, Jonze's Max becomes overwhelmed with anxiety about his problems, yells at and bites his mother, and actually runs away from home, stealing a boat and truly, at least according to the screen narrative, sailing to the island where the wild things live. Of course, this part of the film story is, as is Sindak's book, metaphorical. We certainly aren't told that Max's mother has called out the search party to find her son during the time he's gone, so obviously he's not gone very long, although he seems to be in the film. He seems to be gone for days or weeks. Yet, since it is presented realistically on screen, and since it follows a good bit of development of Max's emotional problems, the narrative tension during Max's escape is much stronger. This is Max, actually. He's stolen the boat and he's landing on the shore of the Wild Things, of the island of the Wild Things, and it was a very tempestuous crossing here, and he's cold and he's wet and he's barely dragging his boat in. If you've seen the film, you'll realize there are quite a few, a minute or two, so a few minutes, in which he was doing this. He's in the boat, lots of sound in the background, but it's very tension-filled compared to the very gentle book by Sindak. All right, Jones's Max, because he is dealing with emotional problems that are much more troubling, has a harder time of dealing with the wild things, and several scenes from the film show him afraid of them, even in danger of being hurt by them, and their impetuousness and wild things' strength. They are projections of a troubled child who is at the mercy of emotions and events he cannot control and adult situations he does not understand. Despite the differences, the film, like Sindak's book, presents this fantasy place as being the physical location where the child does successfully come to terms with his issues, returning home a more integrated child. It is a well-done film, and I encourage you to watch it if you haven't, and to compare the two versions, the book and the film, or just take my summer film class, because this is one of the ones we do in that summer class. All right, Peter Pan. Peter Pan has become more than just a children's classic story. It has reached almost mythic status in the 100-plus years since J.M. Barrie first came up with the idea of a boy who never grows up, and it has been retold many, many times for them by Barrie himself. Here's a cover of one of the early versions. It's not even Peter Pan. It's Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. This was the first story Barrie wrote with Peter Pan in it. He is a baby in Kensington Gardens, so that's the cover of the first edition, or an early edition. I'm not sure if it's the first. Audiences have seen various stages, various stage plays, various, I've lost my place. Various stage plays, televised plays, movie versions, movies only loosely based on Barrie's story. Hook, anyone? A truly evil Peter Pan in a TV show about fairy tales. Which show am I talking about? Once Upon a Time, ABC. And of course, books, books, and books. Here's a cover of the play itself was performed in 1903/1904, and so he wrote it as a play first. And for Barrie, the performance of the play was really the heart of Peter Pan. But he had the early book, and then he had a novel in 1911, Peter and Wendy, and this is the cover of Peter and Wendy, and that book is actually the one I'm going to focus on here. There are many aspects of this story we could address, but in terms of fantasy settings as places of imagination in which child characters and child readers work out issues regarding growing up and identity formation, I just want to touch on Neverland itself for today. And I just included this. This is the frontispiece of the book in the previous slide. You can see here's Hook, there's an Indian, and there's the parents, and then the children here. So I just pulled out a couple of pictures from Project Gutenberg and stuff. So we're going to talk about Neverland. In the novel version of Peter Pan, Peter and Wendy, which Barrie published in 1911, 7 years after the play had become a hit, Barrie unequivocally equates this place with a child's imagination. Now, before I go to the quote, here's a picture of Neverland, but as I say down here, there was no picture provided in the story. This is, you have pictures, you'll have lots of pictures of Neverland, the map, but they're done by other people, sometimes fan fiction kinds of things, or Disney, of course, and so this is one of them. And this is the quote. Barrie clearly connects Neverland with a child's imagination. This is the narrator in the book talking. I don't know whether you have ever seen a map of a person's mind. There are zigzag lines on it, just like your temperature on a card. And these are probably roads on the island, for the Neverland is always more or less an island, with astonishing splashes of color here and there, and coral reefs and rakish-looking craft in the offing, and savages in lonely lairs, and gnomes who are mostly tailors, and caves through which a river runs, and princes with 6 elders, and elder brothers, and a hut fast going to decay, and one small old lady with a hooked nose. You notice all those things are actually references to classic children's text, stories, and that kind of thing. It would be an easy map if that were all. But there's also first day of school, religion, fathers, the round pond, needlework, murders, hangings. He actually has this in the book, y'all. Verbs that take the dative, chocolate pudding day, getting into braces, and a few other things that were really just relevant to Edwardian children, and I took them out. And either these are part of the island or they are another map showing through. And it is all rather confusing, especially as nothing will stand still. And that's from the book Peter and Wendy in chapter 1. So that's an early description of Neverland. This description tracks remarkably well with modern day theories about the role of imagination and fantasy in a child's mental and emotional development, which say that children playing pretend are actually doing the same thing that scientists do when hypothesizing and testing various theories about the world or social structures in that world by exploring, in a safe place, the imagination, various social roles, behaviors, ways of dressing, acting, talking, etc. A child learns not only about the world, but also how he or she can function successfully and satisfyingly in it. In Barry's story, Neverland is individual to each child. This is a couple more quotes. Though similar in some ways, and it is a projection of each child's inner concerns and desires, each child's psyche. And some more quotes from the book. Here's another one, and it comes just a few paragraphs, maybe one paragraph of the one I just showed you. Of course, the Neverlands vary, and it's plural, vary a good deal. John's, for instance, had a lagoon with flamingos flying over it. John lived in a boat turned upside down on the sands. Michael was in a wigwam. Wendy in a house of leaves deftly sewn together. Wendy had a pet wolf forsaken by its parents. On these, and lots of other details, I was kind of trying to cut the quote short. And then that description ends with, on these magic shores, children at play are forever beaching their coracles. We too have been there. We can still hear the sound of the surf, though we shall land no more. Something I'm not really talking about today, but I do when I talk about the book with my classes, is this shift between a child's perspective and point of view and that adult commentator. And you can hear that voice coming through pretty clearly right here. There's another quote, again about the islands. Of all delectable islands, the Neverland is the snuggest and most compact. Not large and sprawl, you know, with tedious distances between one adventure and another, but nicely crammed. When you play at it by day with the chairs and tablecloth, it is not the least alarming. But in the 2 minutes before you go to sleep, it becomes very nearly real. That is why there are night lights. So in Barry's story, Neverland is individual to each child, though generally similar in some ways, and it is a projection of each child's inner concerns and desires, each child's psyche. Yet it is also a projection of Peter Pan's psyche. And some more quotes. This is the famous quote saying how to get there. Second to the right and straight on till morning. That, Peter had told Wendy, was the way to the Neverland. But even birds carrying maps and consulting them at windy corners could not have cited it with these instructions. Peter, you see, just said anything that came into his head. And when the kids are actually going with Peter to Neverland, it's not just a sweet little simple journey. They very nearly die. He forgets them. They don't eat. It's a traumatic journey and takes quite a while because it's Peter's place. The other quote, in the old days at home, the Neverland had always begun to look a little dark and threatening by bedtime. Then unexplored patches arose in it and spread. Black shadows moved about in them. The roar of the beast of prey was quite different now. And above all, you lost the certainty that you would win. Of course, the Neverland had been make-believe in those days, but it was real now. And there were no night lights, and it was getting darker every moment. Thus sharply did the terrified three learn the difference between an island of make-believe and the same island come true. So in the book, it does seem to be true, and it's Peter's psyche that they're playing through, as well as theirs. It's an interesting mix for Barry. It's not really clear-cut, and that's what makes it so cool to think about. Here is another map of Neverland. And the quote, again, from Peter and Wendy, this time chapter 5. The Neverland, feeling that Peter was on his way back, the Neverland had again woke into life. And that's when the pirates start doing things, the Indians start doing things. And it is clearly from all these quotes and some others that it is Peter's imagination that they are now engaging in, but that Peter's imagination is also their imagination because Peter's not real. He is childhood. When Wendy and John and Michael visit Neverland, they act out their childish desires for play and try on various identities or adult roles. This is especially true for Wendy, who is enticed to go with Peter to Neverland because the Lost Boys need a mother. And female adulthood is the role that she plays at during the entire time she is there. That comes across very strongly if you read the novel. It doesn't come across as strongly in the Disney film or in the sequels, especially the one featuring Wendy's daughter Jane. But anyway, in the book it's very clear. The little mother is darning socks in the home underground for days at a time. We're told that. She's giving the children medicine, worrying about their safety and their nap time, and romancing Peter Pan. Remember, Wendy asks Peter for a kiss, even before they leave her nursery on that fateful journey. She's definitely a little woman. The phrase is, she's every inch a little woman, even though there are not that many inches of her. Tinkerbell is so jealous of Wendy that she tries to get Wendy killed more than once, and Peter's role in Wendy's fantasy is father, while she is mother, and the rest of them are their children. In fact, Wendy decides to leave Neverland when Peter is confused about whether he is her child or her marriage partner. And the chapter in which this happens is called, ironically, The Happy Home. So for Wendy, Neverland is a place where she can try on adult female roles. And Barry's story presents her as embracing these roles of wife and mother with excitement and seriousness. Here are a couple more early illustrations from the Peter Pan stories. This is from 1907. Before the book, Peter and Wendy, even came out. It's just a picture from the Peter Pan picture book. And this is Wendy telling stories to Peter Pan and the Lost Boys is the caption for the illustration. And you can see that they're definitely in a child position. She is the mother. And then you have another picture. There was no date, but it's one of the early versions. Here is Wendy with her house. And this one isn't underground, although the novel clearly says she's underground. And here the Lost Boys and probably Peter Pan somewhere in there, again, presented as her children. She's the mother figure. On the other hand, for the boys, John and Michael, as well as Peter and the Lost Boys, who are in the novel supposedly human as much as are John, Michael, and Wendy, they only play at childish roles, being Wendy's children, fighting pirates and Indians, and playing hide and seek in the jungle on the island. For Barry, Neverland is a place of escape from boring adulthood for males. And Wendy's brothers are very nearly trapped into staying forever by this fantasy. It is Wendy who realizes that they are forgetting home and parents and that it is time to leave Neverland. And despite the delay that the pirates provide by kidnapping them and forcing Peter to fight to save them, the children do return home. Wendy, at least, is ready to take on more adult roles in life, leaving Peter, the boy who refuses to grow up, to stay in Neverland permanently. There are lots more things that we could have said, or you could think about, with Peter and Wendy and the adult roles versus the childish roles and Peter's projection of childhood. But that's enough to get you thinking. All right, I showed you two maps of Neverland a few minutes ago, noting that Barry himself did not provide a visual map for the children's adventures, though Disney and many other people have done so. Yet maps are very prevalent in fantasy literature, adult literature as well as juvenile literature, and though sometimes they are decorative more than anything else, they often play a significant role in the narrative. Maps, by virtue of their role of circumscribing and defining a place, stabilize a fantasy land by giving it realism and substance. A map makes an imaginary place seem more real. Maps in books are iconotexts, a concept used primarily in children's picture book research and in intermediary studies. And I told you what that is. An iconotext is a work of art made up of verbal and visual signs. Since the purpose of a map is to provide a visual representation of a place, when maps appear in a text, their presence and function in that text is significant. Maps, especially maps in children's fantasy texts, visually describe a place that exists via the art and skill of the creator, a place that is drawn from both reality and imagination, and they have certain functions And here are the three basic functions of maps in a book. They can serve as part of the story itself, a trope or story element that drives the action, such as Jim Hawkins' treasure map in Treasure Island. I'm not talking about that, but that gives you an idea of what I'm talking about there. Maps can also serve as just a reference guide for the reader to follow the plot of a story, usually following the journey. You've got Taran following his journey of actually growing up and wandering around Prydain and Lloyd Alexander's Prydain Chronicles. You've got Frodo in The Hobbit. You've got a map for that. If you're a fantasy reader, you clearly know, these first two reasons for maps being in a text. Another role for maps is identifying particular places of importance in a story, thus endowing those places with special significance apart from just way stations on a trip or giving a general idea of landscape, like especially in this one. This kind of map is presented from a subjective perspective rather than an objective one, and it's what we're about to talk about. A. Milne. His two collections of short stories, Winnie the Pooh, 1926, and House at Pooh Corner, 1928, are clearly defined by a sense of place in many ways. The stories detail the adventures of a small boy named Christopher Robin, who in the narrative lives in a forest where Pooh and his friends also live, and where they have adventures such as woozle hunting, undertaking an expedition to the North Pole, surviving a flood, as well as more domestic events such as birthday parties, visiting neighbors for a little something to eat, and tricking bees out of their honey. The sites of these adventures, including homes of the animals, are marked out on the map drawn by E.H. Shepard for the first collection, seen here, and purportedly, I don't know if you can read it, but purportedly drawn by Christopher Robin, supposedly the character in the story. Down here it says, drawn by me, and Mr. Shepard helped. You see some misspellings. Helped doesn't have the E in it. Here you have where around Owl's house, there's no apostrophe. Always a bugbear of mine as a teacher. You have 100 Acre Wood misspelled. You have some other misspellings. But this is the map of the forest. 100 Acre Wood, by the way, in the books is just the part around Owl's house. This whole thing is called the forest. It's in the Disney films. That the whole thing has come to be called 100 Acre Wood, but that's just a part of this. And so anyway, you see that this is very much a child's map. You have the main feature of this map is the places that people live: Pooh Bear's house, Six Pine Trees, Piglet's house, where the woozle wasn't. Up there in the corner, up in the very top, you see To the North Pole. This says my house, meaning Christopher Robin's house. So houses are predominant, and other places, Pooh's Trap for Heffalumps, places that are significant in the story for a child's perspective. It's very much a child's map, not a regular map. You don't have any kind of markers as to how far it takes to get from one place to another. So you have all these things. Critics have noted that many of the sites described by Milne in the stories and drawn by Shepard on the map and elsewhere derived both in description and in place names from the very real environs of the vacation home of the Milnes, which is called Cochford Farm, near the village of Hertford in Sussex, England. Cochford Farm was, and it still is actually, on the northern edge of a tract of land called the 500 Acre Wood, on the edge of Ashdown Forest, an ancient forest that was once a royal hunting ground. And here's a map of that. And which is today one of England's largest forests. 500 Acre Wood is a beech forest that was split from Ashdown in 1678 and now is privately owned, and one can take guided tours of Ashdown Forest. You can drive through it, but you can take tours, and I'm not telling you to reach, but up there is the 500 Acre Wood up at the northeast corner, and right above that you see Hartfield marked, and that's where the village where Cotsford Farm was right outside of. So this is an actual map of an actual place. The Milnes lived right outside of Hatfield. So that map that we just saw and the stories are based on real places. So this is a comparison there. If one compares Shepard's map to an actual map, such as the this one, featured in Christopher Milne's, the real Christopher Robin. This is his map included in his autobiography called The Enchanted Places of the actual place. And you see Cotchford Farm here, Six Pine Trees, Owl's House. He's marked some of those things, and here's 500 Acre Wood. But it's a very different perspective than the one we have from the child's perspective. The 500 Acre Wood was a familiar place to the Milnes during their son's early childhood, with special spots that Christopher Milne remembered fondly in his autobiography, The Enchanted Places. These spots in turn became sites of the fantasy that Milne created with and for his young son. In fact, Christopher Milne claimed in his autobiography that, this is a quote, "Pooh's Forest and Ashdown Forest are identical," but you can see that they're not. They're not given in the same perspective in the maps, but you also have differences in other things being included and space between places. So the book is an idealized version of this, so those stories are. The map shows these places from a child, Shepherd's map shows these places from a child's perspective, and it is literally drawn from a child's perspective. Drawn by Christopher Robin himself, supposedly. The legend claims. Places that would be important to a child are featured, while ordinary topographical details are not, such as here. This is a topographical map. And then the next 2 or 3 slides are just actual scenes from the 500 Acre Wood. You can find them, tons of these kinds of pictures. It's actual, you can take a guided tour there, you guys. So it's part of the tourism business to show these places. You find markers of the things that were going on in the books. You have markers for Pooh's Bridge and all these kinds of things. So you have, if you can see, if one compares Shepherd's map to an actual map such as the one Christopher Milne included in the Enchanted Places, one can see the similarities, but also the fact that the forest is a child's fantasy world, written about and drawn for a child. Shepherd's sketches of Ashdown Forest that he did while working on the Pooh map and other illustrations can actually be found in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So you could, if you wanted to, compare those kinds of things. But here we have a tree from the 500 Acre Wood, which looks to me like owl's tree. You have, this is an actual gravel pit or quarry. I mean, Rue's sandy pit. This is what was used as the setting for that. Here's Eeyore's sad and gloomy place. These were places that were real places that were transformed into these fictional places. Here's Poohstick's Bridge. Here's an actual picture of it. There is a shepherd's illustration of it. Here's Pooh, and here's Rabbit playing Poohsticks. By the way, that term Poohsticks was coined in these books, so Milne created that. And here's the map again, so you can look at that. The Pooh stories describe the everyday doings of a small boy and a group of animals, but as you all know, the animals are actually stuffed toys. In actuality, most of them were Christopher Robin's actual stuffed toys. Pooh's Forest is not a wild place full of lions and tigers and bears, oh my. It is an inclusive a world where everyone can find a place and be accepted for who he is, despite his idiosyncratic personality. It is a place where Rabbit must learn that strange animals, such as Kanga and Roo and Tigger, can and should be allowed to live happily. Pooh's Forest is a world unto itself, a world of harmony where even the North Pole can be found within a day's walk, and where gentleness rules the day, and even a flood can be negotiated by riding in an upside-down umbrella, if only, huh? It is a place of safety where there are no real monsters. Heffalumps and woozles exist only in the imagination of the inhabitants or turn out to be oneself or one's next-door neighbor. Each inhabitant has his own home in the forest, designated by Shepherd's map and described by Milne in the stories. Most are tree houses. Owl lives up in a tree, Pooh and Piglet live near the roots of different trees, and even Christopher Robin has his own tree house located at the very top, or near the top, of the forest, as befitting him as Lord of the Forest and the human inhabitant. Despite being trees, however, the homes are quite comfy, complete with whatever amenities the owners need, such as cupboards, tables and chairs, a mirror to do your exercises in front of, as Pooh has, beds, doors. The homes are physical representations of the safety and sense of belonging in the forest, and they're molded by the owner's personalities. Gloomy Eeyore lives in a thistly field labeled Eeyore's Gloomy Place. That's down here. on the map, in which Eeyore says is my corner of the forest, the damp bit down on the right, which nobody wants. That's a quote. And which, another quote from Eeyore, for people who like cold, wet, ugly bits is something rather special. Each home, both in the stories and on the map, mark the various characters' imprint on the landscape of a supposedly undomesticated forest, tempering the freedom of untamed nature with the comforts of a civilized and safe life. It's the best of both worlds, isn't it? As a creative fiction, Pooh's Forest represents Christopher Robin's childhood, but it's an idealized one, developed from 3 different venues. From the father, Alan Milne's own nostalgic memories of his childhood, and his childhood ramblings, from his adult perception of his child's preschool years and the time they spent wandering that forest as a family and taking walks, and from his own observations of his child as he was growing up, and including the visual depictions contributed by the illustrator. It's also from E.H. Shepard's observations of the physical location in which that childhood was taking place and in which the fictional stories were set, along with the real-life toys and the child about whom the stories were being told. Shepard actually went to Ashdown Forest and drew lots of sketches and watched Christopher Robin in play. So his sketches are based on reality, but they're a blend of reality and fiction. The opening of the first collection establishes this multi-dimensional narrative structure. The stories begin with a child named Christopher Robin asking to be told a story by his father. This child is clearly young, depending on a parental figure for entertainment and emotional assurance. The father, in turn, creates stories about a boy named Christopher Robin and his toys, a boy who is much more independent and confident, who is, in turn, the parental figure for the inhabitants of the forest. These stories, which all take place within the forest, are interrupted periodically by the fictional child who is hearing them within the book with comments like, I didn't hurt him when I shot him, did I? During the story of Pooh and the Bees, or didn't I give him anything? And was Pooh's pencil case any better than mine? During the 2 stories in which you had birthday parties. That child that's hearing the stories in the book is interrupting the stories being told with those kinds of comments. So it's actually really complex, this narrative stance. But yet that child is a fictionalized persona, and then he has this avatar of Christopher Robin in the books themselves. The fictional child who is hearing the stories wants to be included in the stories and be reassured that the stories are about him. He wants to be physically present in the stories his father is making up. Yet the Christopher Robin who lives in the forest is a persona for him, someone not him. He is confident, the fictional, in the forest Christopher Robin, they're both fictional. He is confident, saying things carelessly when he isn't sure he's right, getting things wrong, but it doesn't matter. And he is the go-to person that the other inhabitants look up to, often resolving their anxieties and problems. In the second collection of Pooh stories, published in 1928, and the real Milne child was about 8 years old then, or maybe 7. Yeah, 1921 is when he was born. There is no direct interaction between fictional frame story with its child audience plus father narrator. The action is told directly by a third-person narrator. Yet Christopher Robin is much more part of the action, with numerous comments on where he is, even when he's not there. They're wondering where he is. What he's doing, whether it's in the forest or out of it, how he affects what happens in the forest and the inhabitants thereof. He's very present, but not in the same way as in that first collection, because he's older. The real Christopher Milne is older. The books have progressed. In the first collection, the final story is subtitled We Say Goodbye. The main action centers on a birthday party for Pooh, and that story ends with Pooh and Piglet companionably walking off together, with the very final ending featuring the fictional audience Christopher Robin, that frame story one, regretfully going to take his bedtime bath. The second set, however, and the Pooh stories as a whole conclude with the story called Christopher Robin and Pooh Come to an Enchanted Place, and we leave them there. We do so because Christopher Robin, who has been mysteriously busy for much of the book, must leave childhood and go to school, think all caps. This last story begins with the phrase, Christopher Robin was going away. Nobody knew he was going. Indeed, nobody even knew why he knew that Christopher Robin was going away. But somehow or other, everybody in the forest felt that it was happening at last. The final scene in the book is of Christopher Robin and Pooh walking together, quote, thinking of this and that, and by they came to an enchanted place on the very top of the forest called Galleon's Lap. Here, Christopher Robin tells Pooh about school and the fact that he is not going to do nothing anymore because they don't let you. Oh, yes. And he asks Pooh to occasionally visit Galleon's lap, even if he is not going to be there anymore. Clearly, idealized childhood is eternal, even if childhood itself is not. And I'm going to go ahead and conclude. We've touched on three, and there's one more picture. Well, actually, there are 2 or 3 more pictures. A couple of pictures of the places that Shepard sketched. Here's Pooh stuck in Rabbit's doorway. Here's Owl's house. I can go through these really quickly. There's the expedition to the North Pole. And here are Pooh and Christopher Robin going to Galleon's lap. This is the last story of the set. And the very last one is a sketch of Christopher Robin dragging Pooh down the stairs. It's from the frame story of Winnie the Pooh. It's kind of out of order, but that's it, and that's my last slide. We've touched on 3 fantasy locations in children's books: the Land of the Wild Things, Neverland, and Pooh's Forest, considering how these sites are places where a child enacts psychological issues relating to the growing up process in some way. There are many, many other books I could mention in which the fantasy world is vicariously the place where a child resolves real-world issues. Narnia, where the Pevensie children fight a battle between good and evil that parallels the one happening in World War II, and which is the reason the children are at the professor's house with the magic wardrobe in the first place. I could mention Wonderland, where Alice learns to negotiate the mad world of grown-ups. In Victorian England, I could have mentioned more. Treasure Island, the riverbank of Rat, Mole, and Otter, the jungle of Mowgli, Baloo, and Bagheera, and many, many others. I would encourage you all to revisit these classics from your childhood and consider how these stories helped you yourselves see that pretend places are safe places in which a child, whether a fictional character or a real audience, can try on identities and have adventures, and in so doing, learn about the very real, very serious world that he or she lives in. The end. And thanks. I think we might have 5 minutes for questions. If anybody has a question or a comment. Margaret?
Yeah.
I actually know some of y'all.
On the Shepherd's map,
Mm-hmm.
the north, south, east, west,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't say north, south, east, west. Do you know what it's
A
meaning?
child wouldn't care about that kind of thing. It's from that child's perspective. So yeah. It's very much that child. It's supposed to be drawn from Christopher Robin's perspective. So yeah.
So we don't know what those actually stand for, like there was a P at the bottom or an S at the bottom and a P at the top.
Yeah. I think that was north-south. I'll have to go back to that.
I couldn't quite see it. The other one's actually
It's P-O, yes, it's P-O-O-H. You're right, Sarah, yeah, Pooh. It's the world of Pooh. Pooh's everywhere. Any other questions or thoughts? Oh, yeah.
You mentioned when discussing Peter Pan the jealousy of Tinkerbell.
Yes.
Was Tinkerbell exemplified as a child or as?
No, she is a grown-up fairy who also loves Peter. Part of the very adult humor is how Peter's oblivious to that. Wendy clues in immediately. She knows why Tinkerbell hates her, and she hates Tinkerbell. She hates the mermaid. It's very much a toxic female situation. So not in the Disney film, but in the book. Yeah. Sarah?
Obviously, I would assume Mill proved Shepherd's map for inclusion in the Pooh stories. And obviously Sinbad did his own wild things. Do we have any notion as to whether Barry had thoughts about the early illustrations of a Neverland map?
No. Peter and Wendy, which is the book, is not really illustrated. That early Peter Pan and Kensington Gardens, that's a very different thing. There was a map in Kensington Gardens. Kensington Gardens is a real place. Again, you have this blend between pretend and real. So you have the map there, and Arthur Rackham did the illustrations. But no, Barry wasn't really that concerned about a map. He had other concerns. So yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, thank you guys for coming.